This is Below the Surface, an Eclipsium podcast where we talk about supply chain and firmware security. It features guests from the cybersecurity industry and discuss the problems surrounding supply chain related issues and potential solutions. Welcome everyone to the August 2022 Below the Surface. I'm Paul Sidorian, the firmware security evangelist for Eclipsium. With me, of course, is Scott Shefferman. I always forget your title, Scott. Shaggy. Scott Shaggy Shefferman.
Scott Shaggy Shefferman works. Principal strategist here at Eclipsium.
Fantastic. Well, as always, we're here to update everyone on the Below the Surface threat report and the contents within. And man, you were on fire this month, Scott. You started with this idea of the root of trust, and you went in a lot of different directions, all tying back to the root of trust, and it was an amazing read.
I appreciate that, man. A lot of that was actually drawn from inspiration from the last couple of blogs we've written too. So probably some good back and forth we can have just right there alone on secure boot and Intel ME, BMCs, etc. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting how when you think root of trust, your brain could initially just go to the secure boot process, right? But it does apply to all aspects, especially when we talk about firmware security and all these different components we have inside of our computers.
Yeah. The thing, so the theme was root of trust, right? For the Below the Surface. But what's interesting about the term root of trust when we come from whatever the cyber industry as practitioners and leaders is we normally confine those words, root of trust, to a kind of very narrow definition of what we mean by root of trust. And it's more often than not related to some kind of crypto system that ties trust to hardware. And without going into any of those details, the point of the Below the Surface threat report from a thought leadership perspective is to actually expand what we mean by the word trust when we're talking about hardware and firmware, in particular hardware and firmware that comes from this massive supply chain above us, for which we are assuming trust for as devices. And so we're not just talking about the narrow definition here with root of trust with secure boot when you validate the code before it boots up and the Windows operating system only allows for signed code, etc. We're definitely talking about that, but we're also expanding it, right? We're expanding the definition of root of trust to something beyond just the integrity of software, meaning the software is what it was supposed to be from the source you got it from, right? That's the narrow definition. The expanded definition, what we want to explore, and we really desperately need to explore, not just at a technical level and an industry level, but even at a national security level, which we're starting to realize, is that trust itself has been completely misplaced. And before we dive into any details, I think let's keep this conversation kind of flowing at a higher level, because anyone that's been alive for any amount of time, remembers all the free trade kind of agreements we've had with China, Taiwan, and other sources, where we kind of made this giant assumption that we're going to trust them as equal trading partners. And the game theory would tell us that if they do well and we do well together, we're both stronger for it, right? The they and the us, so to speak. And it's not playing out that way. Hindsight's always 20/20, but looking back, maybe this was the wrong assumptive trust that we put in a IT supply chain region and set of providers, because that code, right, the hardware as well, but the code comes from all the way down and finds itself in front of every device you're looking at right now in front of you as you listen to this, whether it's mobile or whether it's a laptop or a server blade, anything, a networking device, your home router, all of that code comes from the same source that we've been entrusting, right? So that's at the high macro level. And as you walk that dog down that supply chain, and then you feel as an enterprise, you look around and you say, these are all the devices in my enterprise that I have AOR or responsibility for. But you don't really have responsibility for those devices at a trust level because you've never been able to inspect, audit, enforce, manage the security risk for the code on the devices that ship, right? So that's just to kind of kick us off and get the juices flowing. The whole point is to expand what we mean by root of trust And maybe the best analogy to use for that is when it comes time to trust another human, right? So we don't confine trust to integrity when it comes to humans. That's an important part. That, in fact, in that analogy, the integrity of a human, it doesn't mean like their moral integrity. It means also their composition. Are they actually the person you think you're talking to at the other end of the line or whatever, right? Like, is it actually them? And you know that it's actually them. But when it comes to trusting humans, like devices, you have to expand trust to things like, are they reliable? Do they show up on time to work, right? Are they trustworthy from an integrity standpoint? Are they malicious? Do they have a dual set of motives, right? A hidden one and an overt one. Do you trust them from a capability standpoint? Can they do their job well or play a sport well enough to trust that in the right moment they'll come through for you? And that's what we mean as humans when we talk about trust when we talk about humans. But why don't we have the same benchmark for devices? Why are we only worrying about integrity when it comes to asking the question, should I trust this device as, let's say, Microsoft Windows operating system or Linux or Mac? Why are they
Yeah, and it's
trusting the
interesting, Scott.
device?
Like when we get a new device, I think there's this implicit trust that we have with that device. Like just because it came brand new in the box and it landed on my doorstep and I unpack it, like everyone's like, wow, that what what badness could have happened up until this point? Like I trust it. Now, as soon as I get it connected to the internet and as soon as it's exposed to other people in my house and I start traveling with it, I think that's, when we start trusting less. Is when we've taken it out of that box, right, from that point and connected it to the network and traveled with it and all that stuff. But we
Yeah.
shouldn't really have that implicit level of trust because, I like the root of trust analogy because it implies that there not just is a root, but there's a chain. You described it as a tree, right? Or there's some kind of chain. And that's what a lot of times attackers are banking on because if they can compromise the root of that trust, everything after that in the chain is also implicitly trusted. And we see this with bootkits, right? Bootkits can get at the heart of the first phases of the boot process. Implicitly, everything else is trusted after that. So I just need to tell everything after the initial phase, hey, trust this little piece of code. And then after that, well, now that you're trusted and you're running my code, trust this other piece of code I'm going to put in the next phase. I mean, that's how a bootkit really exploits that root of trust in the boot process. But now there's all kinds of other things that happen on your computer as well that you can exploit that similar level of trust. I trust it when, my hard drive turns on, it runs firmware and it's trusted. Really? Is it? How do you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So the tree analogy you mentioned, I was trying to find an analogy that would describe what we like to call here at Eclipsium, right? The kind of bi-directional flow of trust. And the ones that you were speaking to there, those two examples that you happened to kind of mention, like secure boot and whatnot, is that's from the roots up to the leaves, right? So root of trust is the root that the tree is grounded on. Without the roots, the tree falls over and dies. But and diseases can come from the soil, go up through the trees to the branches to the leaves, right? To the trunk, trees, leaves. But diseases can also flow in a tree from, let's say, aphids on a leaf that flows down into the systemic roots and then kills the tree regardless because it went from the top down or the environment into the tree, kind of like you're saying when you put a device in an operational context, right? Everything changes. But what's really interesting is when we talk even about that cryptographic, tied to hardware with an HSM module trust that's rooting the device in trust because it's grounded to a piece of hardware. Well, there's no such thing as just hardware without software. Otherwise, it might as well be a brick, right? There's no such thing. And what all the code and manufacturers have done, especially since UEFI, and you wrote about this in that awesome blog, that part one series, right? Is they've made it bi-directional and highly extensible. That's one of the four acronyms in UEFI is extensible. And the reason why they did that is because once you have a device given to an end user, if they're going to update the firmware are you really going to ask everybody and their grandma too to boot up into a BIOS and hit an update button or use a password even in the BIOS? No, you're not. So the industry had to create a way to update the firmware, which, think about it, that's a way to update the root of trust. That's a way to update the core foundations of what the device actually is as a device. And you've given that.
Or update, update what it trusts and what it doesn't trust, which I think is
That's
very timely this month. I had a question in a previous webinar, and I want to get back to the person because I wasn't entirely sure, and I'm like, rather give you the wrong answer. But if you've got the allowed software that can participate in secure boot, and you've got the revoked software that is not allowed to participate in secure boot, first is the DB, then you have the DBX, and again, this is very timely to this month as well. And what the question was, what if there's a hash of software, a hash that represents a piece of software in the allow list and in the revoked list? And I was like, well, the answer is always it depends, but largely the secure boot process will check the revoked list first. If the hash is in there, doesn't matter. It's not going to allow boot. So it has to check the revocation list first, right? But you also need, back to your point, Scott, where I was long-winded way of getting around to that, this revocation list has to be updated. And part of this root of trust, I have to trust where this revocation list is coming from, right? That's part of the key structure in secure boot. But I also have to trust that Microsoft is going to do a good job of pushing out this update. And largely, look, they have, I'm not knocking Microsoft, they've got a really hard job, but it caused problems. So now it becomes, do I trust this update enough to apply it to my systems? Which, by the way, is very important that you apply this update to your systems. However, you got to trust it.
Yeah. So what we're kind of dancing around here, Paul, is pretty much indirectly, but we should maybe pivot to it, which is like the impact of the talk that Jesse and Mickey are two primary researchers here at the UEFI level right here at Eclipsium, which everybody listening to this probably knows who they are already because they've spoken at numerous conferences, Black Hat DEF CON, for a very long time, well over a decade on the same topic, right? So when they dropped that bomb at DEF CON 30, just whatever, 4 weeks ago it's been, right, or 3 weeks, it was phenomenal. I mean, the room was packed, but the kind of the mic drop moment for me was the demo. Like we can back our way into like describing the demo first and then go into like some of the details if you want, Paul. But like that moment for me, I looked around the room. I wasn't looking at the slides. I'd already seen those, right? So I'm looking at the room just to gauge whether or not it's clicking. And I saw this moment of like inception where the entire audience was just completely enthralled with the notion that an average attacker can send an average spear phishing email to an average victim and abuse a bootloader to have root on a Windows box in less time than it took me just to say that sentence and subvert the entire stack of all the things and have that presence at the boot cycle to do anything they want to, including read memory, including disable security controls, including, I mean, what do you want to do? What's that commercial? Where do you want to go today? Right? Like it's anything you want to do. And it starts with just a click. And it's way more powerful than a normal rootkit where maybe you have persistence, you're hiding in the registry or you're doing something else. Like that living off the land story from 2015 through 2019 or 20, it's so passe for defenders and attackers at this point. It's so writ that what happens is the attackers now have a bear on their back because eventually some part of your stack is going to catch you using PowerShell, moving around or doing whatever UAC bypass, whatever all the normal things you would normally do in a box to elevate and gain persistence. And that's no longer the story. That's boring for an attacker because you have the bear in your back. You have to buy yourself time. And the only way to buy yourself kind of indefinite time is just dip down into the UEFI, right? Or hang out on a BMC somewhere in the network, or hang out on a network appliance that's on the same subnet. That's what Conti's been doing for a long time, for a long
Yeah.
time, right?
But
So,
I think it's interesting the way you phrased the demo, an average user, average phishing attack, because I think there's this notion that I've seen, out there where people are writing and communicating about these attacks against secure boot and UEFI. And the notion is that in order for you to be a true victim of these attacks, you have to be targeted by a nation state. And therefore, since you are not a nation state target sitting there, working for, a company and you're average everyday home user or whatever, oh, you're not a target of a nation state. Now you very well could be. But I'd also argue that you don't have to be the target of a nation state. That these tactics and techniques that we're describing for attacking UEFI are being found in pretty common malware now today. And if you get that, you could be in a world of hurt. In fact, I think it was LoJax. I was watching a video, someone talking about LoJax, and some of the YouTube comments were, I got this virus. How do I get it off my system? Because I can't seem to get it off my system. I'm like, that's a problem, isn't it? Guess what? I venture to guess you weren't the subject of a nation state attack posting on YouTube asking for help getting this off your system.
well, Paul, it's ironic, right? Because LoJax was a tweaked out version of LoJack, right? It's named after
Mhm.
LoJack,
Right.
which was
Right.
like the car company that turned into a laptop. Wherever your laptop goes, you can find it again, and you should
Mhm.
not be able to remove it. Just like you shouldn't be able to remove the LoJack module in a vehicle that got stolen, right? Like
Right.
it's theft resistance, ironically. So they just like flip that whole script on everybody when that happens. But like, yeah, even like you said, common malware, like what's the most notorious malware group in the world, right? Criminal malware group. It's the TrickBot group. By
Mhm.
and large, emphatically so, they've done more damage and they're a bigger apparatus than anything else out there, period, in a discussion. And, we learned through the TrickBot Conti leaks, which I don't think you and I've talked about on our show yet, but we did extensive research literally going through all of those leaks, right? Looking for whether or not those same attackers that normally live in the OS level are also going down to the firmware. And yes, they are. I mean, obviously, everybody listening to this might know of TrickBoot, which is TrickBot's ability to load a module, one of the many modules that they load down as they need, to actually inspect the UEFI to see if it has BIOS write enable type of vulnerability, and then they can
Mhm.
implant in that firmware or break a device. And that was the 2020 biggest story in the cyber industry of the year with an amazing article in Wired magazine, etc. And then right after that, like the whole SolarWinds things happened right after that and kind of
Yeah, it was
overshadowed
brushed
it, right? It
aside.
got
Yeah.
lost. But what's interesting is when you look through the Conti leaks, they're all the same developers that have now, FBI most wanted and Department of Justice most wanted placards for. Those same actors were also talking about Intel ME and how to use Intel ME to write to PCI Flash. And if you can do that as an attacker, you're on every platform, every Intel platform ever since whatever 2012, probably, right? Like
2006 actually.
Intel ME, yeah. So
Yeah,
2006. I thought it was
2006.
2000. Yes. Okay. So,
Yeah.
okay.
It was
We're
different
splitting
different
hairs,
ar different
right?
architectures. Yeah, again, I wrote the blog post series, that Scott was referencing. The first part was on Secure Boot, the second part is on Intel ME, and I had the luxury of doing a lot of research and talking to our research team to pinpoint these, like, little esoteric things that matter oftentimes. So it has been like an ARC, processor, and then it's a Quark x86, but it's been in almost, as far as I can tell, I say all, but there could be exceptions. Intel chips since 2006. You've basically got a computer inside your computer.
Well, I mean, honestly, if there's two blogs, I mean, we do a ton of writing, but the last two blogs that you wrote, part one and part two, Secure Boot and Intel ME, respectively, I think are some of the most quintessentially important blogs for anybody that's willing to listen to this show right here. Should read those two blogs at a bare minimum because they're so well written and they're written from that perspective of somebody kind of discovering and coming to understand with really good starting questions. You've got how many decades of experience working on a Linux box, for example, and dealing at the BIOS level. But you started with these really good questions and you found the answers to them. And the way you wrote the blog, I related to one because when I came over here at Eclipsium, whatever it's been, 2 years ago, actually, I just had my 2-year anniversary. I looked through the corpus of research that the company had published, and my mind was blown. I had way more questions than answers right off the bat.
Yes.
Like any
Yes.
answer they
Now,
gave me was like 10 more questions.
right. Well, thank you, Scott. And also, part 3, which will be I think the final part in this series, is about something you touched on with TrickBoot and its BIOS write protections. And on the surface, like that sounds pretty straightforward. Turns out not so much. There's a lot of different ways in which the BIOS could or may protect itself from write operations. So that gets a little tricky. It's taking me a little time to put that one together. But that, and again, these are also based on what I see malware attacking and what I see our own product detecting, quite frankly, most often. So I've talked with sales engineers, right? I've talked with, support developers, folks within the company, and I've talked with other people. And like, these are some of the more common issues that I'm trying to highlight that need some explaining, man. Like you said, it's overwhelming when you start looking into some of these issues. So I'm trying to break it down.
Well, it was eyes wide open for me too, coming from the years of being a global director of incident response for large consulting organization, right? Doing all that IR, all that containment eradication. There's one thing you always notice is the attacker. The first thing they do is like a UAC bypass or some kind of escalation of privileges. And I've never worked in IR in my entire career where that hasn't taken place. If you have an incident worth worrying about, it's been elevated really early on and fairly quickly. And on any given Sunday, there's 12 ways to do that. And so we kind of looked into that for a little while. At least I had questions for like Jesse and Mickey, because the talk that they just gave at DEF CON, where it's called, one bootloader to load them all. I was like, well, do you hear in the industry the same thing I heard when I was working in the endpoint space, where, oh, well, you have to be admin to do that, and if an attacker's admin, you've got bigger problems. And I say that in a very cynical voice, but I say it with a lot of empathy as well, because the kind of persona that thinks that an elevation of privilege is a mitigating factor in what an attacker can and wants to do once they're admin, that's a fallacy. And I carried that fallacy for the better part of my career, quite honestly. Even back to like Linux admin days back in the 90s, you really protected that difference between the trust of a user versus an admin on a system. But in Windows, Microsoft themselves don't even consider it a security boundary that the OS should and is meant to enforce or be able to even enforce. It's not even on the horizon of something that they own as a security control that the OS must be able to enforce. Not with Windows, right? So, and this is why on any given Sunday there's 1,000 ways. Okay, I over exaggerated. There's 12 ways to escalate privileges, right? And so, as a result, you have to start anytime you're doing whiteboarding or playbooking or tabletopping, you're developing a playbook. You always start these days with the premise that the attacker is an admin, especially on a Windows box. And from there, you need to be able to ask, from this asset, what are they most likely to do given a potential set of objectives? And if you're not thinking that they might go to UEFI in the year 2022, in the current context of what's going on between relations between China and the United States, you're really doing it wrong. And I'm looking you straight in the camera eye, but like the dynamic has changed and the assumptions have been emphatically wrong. And that's what's brought us to this precipice where you have all sorts of national policy level now worrying about critical software, right? And worrying about things like whether the government can buy software that has vulnerabilities in it. And if does, all software has vulnerabilities in it. So part B of that is if there's mitigations for it that the vendor says are in place and have a timeline to attack, then you can still sell to the government. And all this stuff is being passed through legislation. And obviously at that national level, It's so high level that there's going to be all sorts of problems and dynamics with trying to enforce this. But the notion is in place finally, where we realize we cannot trust all of this third party code that's sitting at that root of trust to kind of bring it back home. Like it's let's take Intel ME or just BMCs in general, right? Baseboard management controllers, this out of band kind of interface that you can manage a set of devices or a whole infrastructure without having to go to the operating system level to manage it, even if the power is off. That's, if you heard about IPMI protocol, that's what a BMC would talk over as a network protocol, and a few others as well, potentially. But the
Yeah,
whole
Intel's
point of it,
ME through AMT will also stay on. I mean, it's accessible even if the computer's off, but still receiving power.
so if you look at the code of what's sitting on a baseboard management controller. And I'm not going to mention names because we're doing some research right now that's non-public and under coordinated disclosure. But if you just look at the code and you just analyze or the permission structure, almost all of the services at the BMC level are running as admin or root. There aren't any user land. And it's a full Linux stack. It's just sitting there. It's got a shell. It's got a web server. It's got way too many things on one little Linux box, way too many services of different functions. Like I come from DoD world, right? In a DoD world, you have STIGs, Security Technical Implementation Guidance. It comes from DISA on down, right? Or NIST, right? These controls tell you that if you have a function on a Linux box, for example, like a web server, you should not have also a database, or you should not also have a set of other. It should be a single purpose OS serving one application. And if it's more than that, it's a finding with risk that needs to be accounted for and mitigated. But you look at a BMC, it's doing all these things running as admin with all this source code coming from way, way, way far upstream, and even open source libraries well outside of the commercial supply chain that themselves have CVSS 10.x scores in them, right? Like, it's insane what arrives on the device that you hook up and you turn on inside a flat network or an out of band network, or some people connect BMCs facing the internet. Let's just pause, Paul, and say this 3 times. Do not allow your BMCs to be accessible from the internet. Do not allow your do you know whether or not your BMCs are accessible from the internet on
I know
any
I
given
know
moment?
Shodan I know Shodan has some that are exposed to the internet. And, to speak to your point of vulnerabilities, one I was talking about today was triple zero SA 00075 Intel Security Advisory is an authentication bypass in the active management technology, which is your tiny little web server on. I mean, AMT is effectively a BMC. I would put it in that class, right? And it's running. And if you can do this on your own, exercise for the listener, you can go on Shoda and look up those ports. And there's, I don't remember how many thousand. We may have talked about it last time too, but they're out there.
And you know what? I think, not to go too far in the weeds for this show, right? But like, I mean, we can do that all day, but like, just keep the conversation flowing. A lot of people don't realize that Intel ME and baseboard management controllers are on the same bus as the UEFI, another word for BIOS. And there is an attack vector from a baseboard management controller or BMC, or Intel ME against writing to the PCI flash with certain things, in place. You can actually do that. That's really, really scary because it also gives you access to things like memory space. Like, and what's stored in memory? Secrets. What secrets? All of them.
Yeah. It's at a higher level, Scott. I describe it as Intel's what they now call CSME, right? But Intel ME, it has the highest level of privileged and the lowest level of access to all of the components within your computer because it was designed that way, right? For a lot of the features and functionality, when we talk about the manageability, it's the ability to rebuild your system remotely. In order to do that, it needs direct access to all of that hardware and to perform a lot of the other functions that it was designed to perform. It needs direct access to all the hardware on your computer. And that's why
I'm gonna.
privacy advocates have been like, well, this is bad. That means it can just access my camera, or it could put a keystroke logger in like your or on the network. So like if you run TCP dump or Wireshark on your computer, you're not going to see the traffic because
It's not even logged to the kernel. It's its own
it,
separate stack,
it
right?
has access to all of the devices
So,
outside the operating system.
all right, so I'm going to do my best to pivot from there back to kind of root of trust concepts that we played around in the threat report. And one of the things, let me see. So where do we want to go? So one of the things about like the talk at DEF CON, and one of the things to understand about this expanded notion of root of trust is that Microsoft has the certificates that it chooses to trust with the vendors, right? That's in place. And if you have any one of those vendors, dozens upon dozens, probably hundreds, I don't know the quantity, but you have all these certificates that's in that store on Microsoft that says this is allowed to run. And it all that means though is that we said at the beginning of this call that the code has its integrity, has not been modified. It is what it was meant to be from whoever authored it. But what it does not do at all is check that code for any vulnerabilities whatsoever, or any backdoors or malicious intent whatsoever, or any features that might also be backdoors or malicious. Who knows? Who cares? They're there nonetheless whatsoever. And so when you the Title One bootloader to rule them all, that bootloader was not a malicious bootloader to start. It's one of three bootloaders from three different vendors that Microsoft trusts that are signed and trusted by Microsoft from their CA. And they're performing exactly as they were designed with a shell at the UEFI level, like we're just speaking about earlier, Paul. And you can do all the things from that shell. Or in another case, let's see, the other one is there's the two UEFI shells, and the other one is actually a silent one. So you get that spear phishing email. You don't even have to click the victim, the user doesn't have to click, please go ahead and run this and reboot your computer. All right. The first two, you have to do that. The third one, you don't have to do that. So you have this silent UEFI boot kit that's there forever. And when I say forever, man, it's not like I'm trying to use hyperbole or over exaggerate. If you look at all of the UEFI attacks in the wild that have been discovered, which has gone exponential the last 3 or 4 years, those campaigns that are being discovered for the first time after they've been in place as a campaign for many years, 3, 4, 5, 6 years before the rest of the entire security stack even has an inkling of a clue of that campaign running for multiple years across entire verticals or specific targets for a certain objective at a nation state level, right? Like, why? Because the whole security stack and the trust we put in that stack, even that whole security stack, is based on the root of trust, which is being compromised left and right.
One
And
of the
that's why
things,
attackers dip underneath and hang out forever, right?
yeah, well, it's interesting, and I don't know if I've shared this with you, Scott, so I apologize, but Microsoft on August 24th did publish an article in the tech community that, I mean, it's a very technical article, but the high level is there will be new and better requirements, more stringent requirements for software submitted through the third party CA program. And so this wasn't like a high level kind of thing. This was like a tech community article. So it talks about the PE file must be aligned with page size and stuff like that in it. But essentially, it's uh, better requirements, more secure requirements for code being submitted to Microsoft. Now, I think this is a great thing from Microsoft. I think it's a response to a lot of the things we talked about in this show, right? In being able to verify that root of trust means you have to put some more stringent requirements on the components that make up that root of trust and things interacting within that root of trust.
Yes. It'll be magnificent if they even achieve 33 efficacy in that objective. I mean, it'll cut down tremendous number of vulnerabilities and it will make a difference. However, right? And this is important for people to understand when we're talking about this root of trust concept. is that there are so many vectors to attack that root of trust. And the one that you just mentioned that they're trying to address is only but one kind of iteration of a use case that is vulnerable currently, right? Via supply chain that they can help enforce. There are other ones though, like if you look at the talk that Jesse and Mickey gave last DEF CON, I think it was BIOS disconnect, right? There you have Dell appliances that have this driver that's called BIOS Connect, right? And we hilariously named the research BIOS Disconnect. But the BIOS Connect feature was meant to update the UEFI firmware from across the network via the OEM's update process. And what is that code that's being updated? Again, it's the root of trust code. So now that we know that, how important would it be for them to securely implement that update process? One would think it would be the absolute most important thing possible for the OEM to do is to protect that update process with controls and SSDLC on the code, etc. But what you find is this industry is like the city of Rome or London. It's just built out kind of this loosey-goosey kind of evolution without any kind of enforcement or control over it, right? So you find this implementation of the update process that's running a vulnerability that's an HTTPS error that it mistakenly trusts any cert, and it doesn't verify the cert. And there's a secondary bug that they found in the process that Jesse and Mickey again found in the process that allows an attacker on the same network to throw any binary and it will take that binary, including a UEFI with a backdoor in it or an implant. And you're asking yourself, how is like a 15 whatever year old HTTPS cert bug error, TLS bug error, still found in the most critical update process on the entire computing landscape? Here we are. And I want to use this as a pivot because we can talk about all the problems, but it's also important to talk about what you can actually do about them, right? Because why have we entrusted the device OEMs as an enterprise, let's say, to ship us secure devices? It's because we have to. We've never really had a choice. You've relegated that AOR to the OEMs because out of necessity, no other reason. But what you're seeing in 2020, 2021, 2022 in this world, like with OEMs shipping VPNs, all of them have RCE exploits across the internet. You're seeing all these UEFI implants. You're seeing all these BIOS, configuration errors. You're seeing secured core PCs that can get rooted immediately. Going back all the way to 2012 with that everybody gets a boot kit. Everyone gets a boot kit blog that we wrote. Like all this stuff's coming down and nobody knows how to take back control. So if you rewind time to like the 2016, 2017 era, that realization that I just articulated is why Yuri and Alex founded Eclipsium, why they authored ChipSec, coming from their expertise inside Intel Corporation, to help any researcher say, these are the bugs you see on this device. Because at that point in time, 2017, nobody had any visibility. And now, of course, you walk the dog, you have this enterprise grade solution that gives you a whole dash. You see all the things. I'm not going to wear my salesman hat here, but I'm going to say very emphatically that for the very first time, you finally have a technology, a suite of technologies with one dash that can understand all the devices and whether or not you have these critical vulnerabilities in them, or even smoking gun implants and backdoors, or firmware that's known to be unreliable and have a bad mean time between failure. Right? You can actually go and hunt for firmware vulnerabilities. You can say, I had a TrickBot infection 3 months ago. I never looked at the UEFI. I'm going to pivot back and see if there's a TrickBoot infection because that same actor came back 2 months later and we don't know how they got in. Well, maybe they never left. So it's all about taking back security control. And that's really what Eclipsium has been able to do, is just like move this needle in a way that gives an organization data enough to know which devices they're going to update for firmware and which ones are vulnerable and what kind of network segments and critical environments. Like, you've never even been able to ask that question as an enterprise before.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think we might have talked about this last time, but how do you know if you have a boot kit? If you're not looking, right? How do you know your root of trust has been compromised if you're not looking? And how do you look securely? What if tools are lying to you as well? We talked about compromising the lowest level portions of your computer and firmware. And what do you trust to validate whether or not you've been compromised?
Yeah. Yeah. And not to put too fine a cap on it, but when you expand the root of trust concept and you place it against again the backdrop of an IT supply chain conundrum that we find ourselves with, you start to understand that like trust itself is an expanded word that we can finally start to address at this device IT supply chain level. We can start to see which OEMs are putting backdoors in our firmware. We can start to, or not on purpose necessarily, maybe not. The whole point, like you said, Paul, was we don't know. Let's find out as a nation, as practitioners, as red teamers. Let's wear a hat when we go in and scope a red team operation for 3 weeks, where within scope is the ability to target the UEFI. Or if you're hitting a data center and you find a SQL bug from the internet and you get a shell back, why not pop down to the BMC layer and pop 25,000 devices like a red team did 2 years ago, instead of living off the land and doing Mimikatz and or PowerShell and all that stuff, right? Dip down to the BMC level, find some BMC vulns, which are everywhere, and compromise an entire data center of 25,000 devices and their backup instances too. How would you like to get that red team report back as an organization? How valuable would that be to you, right? I would rather have a red team do it than a nation state like Russia, who's at some point may or may not pull more destructive kind of triggers, right? Within these organizations, it's not that they can't; they're just choosing not to because of mutually assured technology destruction. It's not like we can't harm them too. We could, right? So fair play. But the whole power of having this low level access and being able to attack at that level is to be able to play that card when and if you choose to do so. It gives you leverage, it gives you game theory advantage, it gives you all sorts of advantage. And the whole time you also get to spy indefinitely too. So you might not want to play that card because the value of spying on an infrastructure is more valuable than destroying it up into some threshold where you choose to change your objective. I mean, that's my, again, 17 years supporting DoD. It's not the first time I've wargamed that inside of a skiff
Yeah,
with an admiral, right?
right. No, and that makes total sense. We've talked about that too. The value of intelligence and secrets oftentimes isn't the secret itself, but how you obtain the secret. And you
Mm,
don't want to tip your hand on how you're obtaining said secrets from your enemy, because then it's done, right?
boom. Yeah, you
And so
never
there
even
could be
want to
stuff
touch them. Yeah.
lurking. I did like the SGX research.
Mm,
That was the epic leak.
mm.
It could be remiss not to call that out specifically. That was actually some of my friends actually sent that to me. Like, "Oh, did you see this?" I'm like, "Yeah, I saw it. It was really, really, really cool
What do you
research."
what do you call that character? The AE combined.
Yeah, I was wondering that too. I was hoping
AE.
you were gonna know.
I wanted to look it up, but I was driving, and I was like, I'll have to remember this later. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a physical problem that cannot be fixed with software, right? And allows you to access memory space at a hardware level that you shouldn't be able to as an attacker. It's hardware related, like Spectre Meltdown, but a totally different type of attack and physical bug. And I don't think it's going to be patchable anytime soon. Now, what I didn't gather yet, Paul, and I don't know if you were able to look at it or not, is what's the likelihood of exploitation and potential impact in a real world context.
Yeah, that's a tricky one in this case, and you never know. Um, you could look at this research in all the facts that have been presented and make some kind of educated guess or assessment, but in my experience, like, it really goes one of two ways. Like, either never, like, it's just a academic exercise, or someone usually, like, if it is exploited in the wild, there's some time that maybe goes by if it's not an immediate, kind of, "We're gonna exploit this thing." Um, Someone does, like, a little extra bit of research, finds another vulnerability, or finds some other condition that just kinda makes it more, like, plausible to pull off this attack. And typically that happens kinda later. So it's kind of a wait and see. When research like this especially comes out, it's kind of a wait and see. Um, I don't think you need to drop everything and address this particular issue. Probably not, but don't lose sight of it. Like it's a wait and see game.
Well, okay, so there's more than two dials, but the two dials I always look at for this kind of conversation, one of them is one you just talk about, which is like complexity or how sophisticated do you need to be, or do you need to chain it with something else, like you're saying. The other dial is like what advantage might you gain as an attacker, and is that advantage worth the effort and time to do this? And if you look at that second dial, the kind of the impact dial, this is a vulnerability in SGX. And for our listeners that don't necessarily know what's inside of SGX, why is that memory so critical to, perfect example, the root of trust for all of compute, is because that's where you find all of your private keys. So if you're using a Signal application that everybody here probably has a Signal app, why? Because it's end-to-end encrypted. How do they do that? They store the private keys somewhere on the device. It's
In the
end-to-end
secure
truth,
in the
right?
secure enclave, as they call it, right?
And that's what SGX is, right? So a
Mhm.
failure there, and again, this is an unpatchable hardware bug. You can't just push a Microsoft Patch Tuesday patch. You might find a mitigating way or a way to detect if this is happening through IO. There are other ways you can kind of indirectly patch, but the core bug itself of memory leaking out of that and attackers knowing where to go to find those RSA keys and SSH keys and everything else is known. So I think, I think I looked into this, and I don't want to misspeak. I can't remember what the industry thought the likelihood was. All the other experts and pundits out there like us, but I'm going to revisit that now that you brought it back up, because I kind of forgot, right? And I now want to go revisit it.
As always, Scott, you've pulled together an amazing list of threats in the wild, industry news, security advisories, some great tools and education and discussions, even some Twitter posts that are uh, taking on basically the security stance of UEFI. Some great resources in there. Any highlights from there that you want to call out specifically?
I've been so heads down on this latest research that we're working on, which I'm not going to say anything about. I'm not even going to hype it up or downplay it either. I'm just going to say it's kept my focus 1000%, and some other folks as well. And I'm eager to see us crunch through it and what comes out the other side. And the reason I care about this research is because it's literally this whole conversation encapsulated in something that you can finally say the problem we think we likely have is actually right here, and let me show you. And at this level of supply chain, that's actually never been done in a robust enough example to compel, let's say, OEMs like, no one in particular, but like HP, Apple, Dell, that level of OEM, to compel them to force requirements from their upstream providers, right? Which I won't mention any names right now, right? And
Yeah,
if
no,
they
I think
can't,
that's an important supply chain aspect that we harp on all the time, but that's really what we need. It's one thing that we need that could help tremendously in the
yeah,
supply chain issue that we have. It's like you
yeah.
said, a lot of companies a little downstream in that supply chain just accept what comes down. And
Well,
we shouldn't, but it should also be an iterative process too, because like not everyone gets everything right 100% of the time. That we can't conceivably expect that. But there needs to be better mechanisms for getting stuff into the initial supply chain and throughout in much better shape security wise than what's happening today. Good
the
lord, I
the
talked about ME manufacturing mode, right? In one of my posts and presentation. Like if a manufacturer doesn't close off those fuses, you can physically alter the hardware if the manufacturer hasn't done it. That's crazy. It's
It
crazy.
is crazy. Well, and then the pundit will say, well, if they have physical control over the box, you have bigger problems anyway. Nothing could be further from the truth when you're talking about an entire supply chain that goes all the way to warehousing and delivery and insiders in your data center and contractors. Like, this stuff gets hit all the time. Oh man, the war stories I could tell from the DoD in that one regard would be phenomenal. But I can't.
I'm
best.
really going to spend some time with your articles in here that you linked to, because some great resources this month, especially in tools in education and discussion. Like, just going through the list just for our audience, like I want to read every single one of these articles. They look
They're
awesome.
good. A lot of that is sourced from various tools. And Paul, you've been helping me too since you've been doing this kind of show for so long.
Yeah, it's
You've got
crowdsourced.
all that
Yeah,
right. But it's crowdsourced from experts, trust communities, and researchers. It's not just, oh, I'm going to Google search for the word firmware and what's in the. That's not what this is. Like this is a very concise, very curated a threat report. I just want to say this one thing too about the whole supply chain paradigm. I mean, you have the good guys, which is, let's say, us and our customers and the enterprises, right, and the missions out there that are just trying to do their jobs and use IT to do that. And then you have the supply chain, which is all the OEMs and everything above it, and all the open source libraries as well that they all compile and bring down to your device. But there's this third element that we didn't talk too much through on this particular show, which is fine. But I still want to leave the impression with anybody listening. That third element is and are the adversaries. And they are way ahead of any semblance of good guys when it comes to understanding supply chain dynamics and how attack vectors flow within them. Even when we did the trick boot research, I remember our CISO at the time, Steve Mancini, good friend, he laughed one time and he said, "It's crazy to me that a criminal ransomware actor like Trick Boot or Conti Group can see your firmware vulnerabilities better than you can as an enterprise or a mission." And that was just like an allegory, if you will, or analogy. But the real truth is, when you zoom out and you look at certain ransomware actors that hit entire supply chain verticals, you'll see them hit this supplier and you'll see them then hit a downstream supplier. But if you do timeline analysis, guess what you also see? You see the same actors hitting a downstream victim first and finding their way upstream. And just like root of trust has bidirectional between the roots and the leaves, the supply chain also has this crazy interconnected many to many mesh data flow of shared repos, of tools that a downstream provider gives to the upstream provider, along with their private keys too sometimes. Like, there's all sorts of ways to attack somewhere in the middle and go down or up. And certain nation states and certain criminal ransomware actors and the nexus of those two working together as well are so good at it. And we are so bad at seeing it. We need to just completely change that and get ahead of this curve. Otherwise, it's only going one direction from here if we don't get ahead of it. Right. So that's my little soapbox on the threat actor side of this. And we should probably do at some point a whole show just on that.
sounds good. Well, Scott, thank you so much for discussing this month's Below the Surface report. As always, you can find it on eclipsium.com. We'll publish this video, the report, and also obviously check out our blog. We put a lot of articles out there on a regular basis. Thanks everyone for listening and watching.